It all started when I moved into this new neighborhood. You know, one of those quiet suburban streets where nothing really happens. The houses all look the same, kids play in the front yards, and there's always someone out mowing their lawn or washing their car. But at the very end of the block, there was one house that stood out. It was old and run down, with peeling paint and cracked windows. The yard was overgrown, weeds reaching up like they were trying to swallow the house whole. It gave off this weird vibe, like the kind of place you'd see in horror movies. And then there was the old man who lived there. I never got his name, but he was hard to miss. He'd sit on his porch every day, in the same old rocking chair, just staring. He never waved, never smiled, just sat there, watching. He was hunched over, always wearing this old, faded brown coat, no matter how hot it was outside. His skin was pale and wrinkled, almost like paper, and his eyes, something about his eyes, always made me uncomfortable. They were these dull, cloudy things, like he was seeing something none of the rest of us could. I asked around about him when I first moved in, curious, but no one really talked about him. People just said he'd been there forever, kept to himself, and it was better to leave him alone. My buddy Jake, who lived a few streets over, was the only one who said anything useful. "Bro, that guy is weird as hell. Stay away from him," Jake said one afternoon while we were shooting hoops. I heard some messed up stories, like kids go missing around here sometimes. And I'm not saying he's involved, but it's kinda SUS, right? I laughed it off at first. Come on, man, he's just some old dude. Probably lonely or something. You really think he's a kidnapper? Or whatever? Jake shrugged. I don't know, but if I were you, I wouldn't mess with him. People don't just sit and stare like that for no reason. He had a point, I guess. There was something off about the guy, but I wasn't scared of him. Just a little creeped out, I figured if I ignored him, he'd ignore me too. For the first few weeks, that's exactly what I did. Every day I'd walk past his house. And every day he'd be in the same spot, sitting in that old chair, his dead eyes tracking my every move. But he never said a word. Never even moved, really. Just stared. It was weird, but eventually I got used to it. I stopped thinking about him as much. He was just part of the neighborhood, like the cracked sidewalks or the rusty streetlights. But then things started to get strange. A couple of weeks went by, and I started to forget about the old man. He was still out there every day, sitting on his porch, but I had my own life to live. School, friends, video games, it all kept me pretty distracted. Plus, I convinced myself that Jake's warnings were just him being dramatic. I mean, yeah, the old guy was creepy, but he hadn't done anything. He was just there, watching, always watching. But then one evening, something changed. I was walking home from Jake's place. We'd been hanging out, playing Call of Duty, and eating junk food just like any other weekend. It was getting late, around 9 p.m., and the street was unusually quiet. You know that kind of silence that makes you feel like something's not right? Like the whole world's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen? That was the vibe that night. As I got closer to my house, I noticed the old man wasn't sitting on his porch like usual. For a second, I felt relieved, thinking maybe he'd finally gone inside. But just as I was passing his yard, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. There he was, standing at the edge of his yard, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't on the porch anymore. No, this time he was standing, his tall, hunched frame barely visible in the dim light of the street lamp. I froze mid-step. My heart started pounding, but I tried to play it cool. Act like I didn't see him, I thought. Just keep walking. But before I could take another step, his raspy voice cut through the silence. "Boy," he croaked, and I swear his voice sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "You lost." I stopped, my body going rigid. I hadn't planned on talking to him. I hadn't even planned on acknowledging him. But there he was, his pale, bony figure looming in the dark, his voice lingering in the air like a bad smell. "And no," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just heading home." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes locked on me. My skin crawled under his gaze, like he was peeling back layers of me with those dull, unblinking eyes. Then slowly, he took a step forward, and that's when I got a better look at his face. Up close, he looked even worse than I imagined. His skin wasn't just pale, it was almost gray, like something long dead. Deep wrinkles creased his face, especially around his mouth and eyes, making him look like he'd been carved out of stone. His eyes were the worst part, though. They weren't just old. They were empty, like he was looking through me instead of at me. Cold, lifeless. "You'll be lost soon," he muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear. The words didn't make sense. "What?" I asked, confused. But he had already turned away, shuffling back toward his porch. He didn't say another word, didn't even glance back. Just disappeared into the shadows like he was never there. I stood there for what felt like forever, my heart racing, my legs frozen in place. What the hell had just happened? What did he mean? "You'll be lost soon?" The way he said it, it wasn't a question. It was more like a warning. Finally, I managed to shake myself out of it and sprinted the rest of the way home. By the time I got inside, I was out of breath, my mind still racing. I locked the door behind me, my hand trembling on the knob. The house was dark, quiet, safe, but I couldn't stop thinking about the old man's face. Those dead, empty eyes staring at me from the dark. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Just some crazy old dude trying to mess with me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there at the edge of his yard, watching, waiting. And those words kept echoing in my head. "You'll be lost soon." I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure. Something wasn't right about that old man. And whatever it was only just beginning. It was about 3 nights later when everything really started to get weird. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was off ever since that encounter with the old man. I told Jake about it, and he just shook his head like I should have listened to him from the start. "Dude, I told you to stay away from that freak," Jake said, leaning back in his chair during lunch. "It's like he knows something. I don't know what, but there's bad vibes all over him." "Yeah, but what can he do? He's just some old guy." I tried to convince myself, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The image of him standing there in the dark, whispering those words, was burned into my brain. That night, I went to bed like usual, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there for what felt like hours, tossing and turning, my mind racing with thoughts of that old house at the end of the street and the man who watched from his porch. I must have eventually dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the middle of the night. The clock on my bedside table read 3:07 a.m. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The house was silent, the kind of silence that's almost deafening. But then I heard it, a soft, scraping noise coming from outside my window. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like someone dragging something heavy along the ground. My heart leapt into my throat. Every instinct told me to stay in bed, to pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know. Slowly, I got out of bed, my legs shaking as I crept over to the window. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the blinds, trying to calm my breathing. Then, with a quick motion, I peeked through. At first, I couldn't see anything. The street outside was dark, lit only by the weak glow of a few streetlights. But then, in the yard of the old man's house, I saw movement. It was him. The old man was outside, not on his porch this time, but standing in the middle of his yard. He was hunched over something, dragging it slowly across the grass. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see what it was. At first, it just looked like a big black bag, but as he pulled it further into the light, I realized it was way too big to be just a bag. My mind raced with horrible possibilities. Was it a body? No, that couldn't be right. There was no way, right? But as I stood there, frozen in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I watched in stunned silence as he dragged the object across the yard and into the shadows behind his house, disappearing from view. For a moment, I stood there unable to move. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but I didn't know what. Call the police? But what would I even tell them? That I saw a creepy old man dragging something across his yard in the middle of the night? They'd think I was crazy. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I must have knocked over something on my desk because I heard a loud thud as a stack of books hit the floor. I froze, glancing back at the window, praying he hadn't heard. But when I looked again, my blood turned to ice. The old man was standing there in the middle of his yard, staring directly at my window. He hadn't been there a second ago. I didn't even hear him move. But there he was, his pale face illuminated by the dim light of the street lamp. those dead eyes locked onto my window. He wasn't dragging anything anymore. He was just standing there, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was like my body had completely shut down, trapped in that moment of pure terror. My mind was racing with a million thoughts, but all I could do was stare back at him, completely paralyzed. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked back into his house, the door creaking shut behind him. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. When I finally snapped out of it, I collapsed onto my bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I was drenched in sweat, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't make sense of what I'd just seen. It didn't seem possible. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to sleep that night. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the window, half expecting him to come back. But the yard remained empty, silent. By the time morning came, I felt like I'd aged 100 years. I kept telling myself it had to be some kind of nightmare, a trick of my tired mind. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. I had seen him. He had seen me. And whatever he was doing that night, it was real. The old man wasn't just strange. There was something seriously wrong with him. And whatever he was hiding, I had a feeling it was much worse than I could have ever imagined. The next day, I was still rattled from what happened the night before. I barely slept, my mind replaying the image of the old man staring up at my window. I couldn't focus on anything at school. All day, I kept thinking about what I'd seen in his yard. The bag, the way he dragged it, and how he just appeared. At lunch, I found Jake at our usual table. He was messing around on his phone, not paying attention to anything. I sat down across from him, still shaken. "Jake, something happened last night," I blurted out. He looked up at me, raising an eyebrow. "What now? The old guy freak you out again?" "This time it's different," I said, leaning in closer so no one could hear. I saw him outside in the middle of the night. He was dragging something, like something big, and then he just stood there staring at my window. It was like he knew I was watching. Jake's expression shifted from casual to serious. "Wait, what? What do you mean something big? Like a body or something?" "I don't know," I said, my voice a little louder than I meant. "But it wasn't normal. I think something's really wrong with that guy. We need to do something." Jake sat back, staring at me like he was processing everything. He didn't laugh this time. After a long pause, he said, "Man, that's messed up. But what can we even do? Call the cops? They'd just think we're messing around." I hated that he was right. We didn't have any real proof, just the ramblings of two teenagers. But I couldn't let it go. "We have to figure out what's going on, Jake. I've got a bad feeling about this." Jake sighed, rubbing his face with his hand. All right. How about this? We go check it out tonight, see what's going on over there. If we find anything, then we call the cops. If not, you can stop freaking out." I didn't like the idea of going back near that house, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I had some answers. "Fine," I said, "but we need to be careful." That night, I met up with Jake at the park a few blocks from my house. It was already dark, and a cold wind blew through the trees, making the place feel even more eerie. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, feeling the weight of what we were about to do. "You sure about this, man?" Jake asked, adjusting the strap of his backpack. He brought a flashlight and a pocket knife, just in case. "Yeah," I replied, though my voice betrayed my nerves. "We'll just take a look, and if we see anything weird, we're out." No hero stuff. We made our way to the old man's house, sticking to the shadows as we approached. His yard looked the same as always, overgrown and silent. The porch was dark, no sign of the old man. Jake led the way, his flashlight off for now. We crept closer, stepping carefully to avoid making any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves making me jump. When we reached the side of the house, Jake signaled for me to follow him around back. That's where I'd seen the old man dragging the bag the night before. My stomach churned as we moved closer to the backyard. As we rounded the corner, my heart nearly stopped. There, half hidden in the shadows, was the same black bag. It was lying near the edge of the yard, just like I'd seen in the middle of the night. But now, up close, I could see it wasn't just any bag. It was a tarp, and something was definitely inside it. Something large. Jake knelt down next to it, pulling out his flashlight. "Dude," he whispered, his voice tense. "What the hell is this?" I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I don't know. We should check it out." Jake hesitated for a second, then slowly unzipped the top of the tarp. The air around us seemed to freeze as the bag peeled open. Inside, we found clothes. Just clothes. Dirty, tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, pulling out an old jacket. "This is just junk." I stood there, confused and relieved at the same time. I'd been expecting something much worse. Maybe even a body. But it was just old clothes. Still, the fact that the old man had been dragging this around in the middle of the night didn't sit right with me. Jake shook his head, zipping the tarp back up. "Okay, this is freaky, but it's not exactly a crime, man." "Yeah," I said, though the unease in my gut didn't go away. "But why would he be dragging this stuff around at 3 a.m.? Before Jake could respond, we both heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the gravel behind us. I turned around so fast I almost lost my balance. There, standing in the doorway of the old man's house, was the silhouette of a figure. The old man, his pale face barely visible in the darkness, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of Jake's flashlight. For a moment, none of us moved. It was like time had stopped. Then the old man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Looking for something?" My heart nearly exploded in my chest. I grabbed Jake's arm, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to go. Now!" Jake didn't argue. We both bolted, running as fast as we could across the yard, not daring to look back. I could hear the old man's footsteps behind us, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until we were back in my house, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. We didn't talk about it much after that. Jake stopped coming around as often, and whenever I brought it up, he'd just shake his head and tell me to let it go. But I couldn't let it go. And then, a week later, Jake disappeared. His mom called me, asking if I'd seen him, but I hadn't. No one had. It was like he'd vanished without a trace. The days after Jake's disappearance were some of the worst of my life. I couldn't believe it at first. I mean, how could Jake, my best friend, just vanish? One minute we were together, sneaking around the old man's yard, and the next he was gone. I couldn't stop thinking about the last time I saw him. The fear in his eyes when we ran from the old man's house, the silence that followed. And now, silence was all I had. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the old man. There was no way Jake's disappearance was a coincidence. I knew that creepy house, that eerie figure dragging bags in the dead of night, had something to do with it. But I couldn't prove it. Not yet. The cops didn't have much to go on. They came around asking questions, but I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That some ghostly old man was stalking us? That we broke into his yard, snooping around in the middle of the night? They wouldn't believe me. Instead, I kept it vague, just told them that Jake and I hung out the night before, and then he stopped showing up. It felt like I was lying to them, and worse, to myself. But I couldn't stay quiet. I had to do something. Every day after school, I found myself walking by the old man's house, trying to catch a glimpse of him, to see if I could figure out where Jake might be. But the porch was always empty now, as if he'd vanished too. It wasn't until a few days later that I saw the old man again. It was late. I'd gone to bed early, trying to block out the gnawing anxiety that had been chewing at me since Jake disappeared. But like clockwork, I woke up again in the middle of the night. 2:45 a.m. this time. My room was dark, but something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but it was like there was a weight in the air, something thick and pressing. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, that sense of dread crawling up my spine. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not just outside, but right below my window. I shot up in bed, my pulse thudding in my ears. I wanted to stay frozen in place, but something deep inside me forced me to move. I crept to the window, my hands trembling as I pulled the blinds back just a crack. The old man was standing in the street, right outside my house, staring directly at my window. Just like before. This time, though, he wasn't alone. There, at his feet, was Jake's backpack. The one he had with him the night we went to the old man's house. The one he'd been carrying when we ran away. My stomach flipped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The old man just stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked on mine through the glass. There was no mistaking it now. This was no coincidence. He knew. He knew I'd been watching him, and he wanted me to know that he was watching me too. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a jacket and threw on my sneakers. My body moved on autopilot, fear and adrenaline surging through my veins. Before I knew it, I was outside, standing in the cool night air, staring down the street at the old man. He hadn't moved. The backpack was still at his feet. I walked toward him, my legs shaking but determined. The closer I got, the more I could see how wrong everything about him was. His skin looked even more decayed, like it was stretched too tightly over his bones. And his eyes, those lifeless, gray orbs, felt like they were pulling me in, freezing me in place. "What did you do to Jake?" I demanded, my voice cracking. It came out louder than I meant, the words cutting through the night. The old man didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his crooked figure swaying slightly, like he was waiting for me to come closer. "You took him," I continued, my throat dry. "Where is he? What did you do?" Slowly, the old man's mouth twisted into a smile, a sick, slow grin that chilled me to my core. He finally spoke, his voice raspy, like air scraping through broken glass. "He's where he belongs," the old man said. His words were slow, deliberate, and cruel. I took a step back, my mind spinning. What the hell does that mean? Where is he? The old man pointed a bony finger down the street, toward his house. "Come see for yourself," he said, his voice almost inviting, like this was some kind of game. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get as far away from him as possible. But something stronger, a desperate need for answers, for closure, forced me to move. I followed him, my footsteps heavy on the pavement as he led me toward his house, toward the place where all of this had started. When we reached his yard, I stopped at the gate, my heart pounding in my chest. The yard looked even more decayed than usual, the weeds taller, the house darker. The air smelled wrong, like rotting leaves and something far worse. He led me up to the porch, and as I got closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The front door, once barely hanging on its hinges, was slightly ajar, and from inside, I could hear faint, muffled sounds. I couldn't make them out at first, but as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't just random noises. They were voices, and one of them sounded like Jake. I pushed past the old man, throwing the door open without thinking. Inside, the house was dark and cold, but there, in the middle of the room, I saw it. Jake's backpack, lying on the floor. "Jake!" I called out, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a figure stepped out of the shadows from the far corner of the room. At first, I didn't recognize him. His clothes were filthy, his hair matted, and his skin looked pale, almost as pale as the old man's. But when he looked up, my heart stopped. It was Jake, but something was wrong. His eyes, once full of life, were now dull, lifeless, just like the old man's. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me with that same empty gaze. "Jake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What would happen to you?" The old man chuckled behind me, a low, rasping laugh that sent chills down my spine. "He's mine now," he said, stepping forward. "Just like you will be." I turned, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. But before I could do anything, the old man's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. His touch was ice cold, and I felt my vision blur as darkness began to creep in from the edges of my sight. "You'll be lost soon," he whispered, his breath like frost on my skin. And then everything went black. When I woke up, it was still dark. My head throbbed, and my body felt heavy, like I had been asleep for days. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The air smelled damp, old, and the room around me was cold, colder than it should have been. I tried to move, but my arms felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. I blinked, trying to shake the grogginess, and slowly, the memory of what had happened started to trickle back into my mind. The old man, Jake, that house. I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning. I was still inside the old man's house, but something was different. The room wasn't just dark, it felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, almost breathing, like they were alive. Shadows stretched across the floor, too thick, too deep, and they didn't move the way shadows should. It was like they were watching me, waiting. And then I saw Jake. He was sitting in the corner of the room, his back against the wall. His head was down, his hair hanging over his face, and his body was eerily still. For a moment, I thought he was dead. But then he raised his head, his eyes catching the faint light filtering through a crack in the wall. Those eyes still empty, still lifeless. "Jake!" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. I could barely get the words out. He didn't respond at first, just stared at me like I was a stranger. Then, slowly, he stood up, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. He stepped toward me, and I saw the full extent of what had happened to him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame, dirt and grime covering every inch of him. "Jake, what happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stopped in front of me, his head tilting to the side, like he was trying to figure something out. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice that was barely his, he whispered, "I'm not Jake anymore." I felt my blood turn to ice. Before I could respond, I heard a sound behind me. The creak of the floorboards, the shuffle of old feet. I turned, and there was the old man, standing in the doorway, his face twisted into that same sickening smile. He looked even worse now, his skin almost translucent, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. But his eyes were alive, glowing with something dark, something hungry. "He's mine now," the old man said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Just like you will be." I staggered to my feet, trying to back away, but my legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. What are you?" I stammered, barely able to breathe. The old man took a step closer, his eyes boring into mine. "I'm what you will become," he said simply. "This house is not just a house. It's a doorway to something beyond you, beyond this world. I've been here for longer than you can imagine, waiting for the right ones." He gestured toward Jake, who stood there, his face blank, his eyes dull. "He came to me, just like you did. And now he's part of me, part of this place. And soon, you will be too." My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. A doorway? A part of him? It didn't make any sense, but deep down, I could feel the truth of it. This place wasn't normal. The house wasn't just some creepy old shack. It was something else, something alive, and it had taken Jake. "No," I said, shaking my head, backing away. "I'm not going to be part of this. I'm getting out of here." The old man chuckled, a dark, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "You think you can leave?" he asked, stepping closer, his smile widening. "No one leaves. Not once they've been chosen." Suddenly, the shadows in the room seemed to move, closing in around me. The walls creaked, groaning like they were alive, and the air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on me. I felt the darkness creeping in, pulling at me, trying to drag me down, to trap me here forever. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With a surge of adrenaline, I bolted for the door, pushing past the old man. He didn't try to stop me, just laughed as I ran, his voice echoing through the house. "You can't escape what's already inside you," he called after me. I didn't look back. I ran through the house, past the rotting walls and the flickering shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. The front door was open, just a few feet away. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the doorknob, when suddenly I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down, my heart racing. A shadow, thick and black, had wrapped itself around my leg, pulling me back. I kicked at it, trying to break free, but the more I struggled, the tighter it held. "You're already lost," the old man's voice echoed through the house. "It's too late." But I wasn't ready to give up. With a final burst of strength, I kicked as hard as I could, and the shadow loosened its grip. I stumbled forward, my hand catching the doorknob. I yanked it open and threw myself outside, collapsing onto the cold, wet ground. The moment I hit the grass, everything went still. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner. I looked back at the house, half expecting the old man to follow me out. But the door was closed now, and the house stood there, dark and silent. as if nothing had happened. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, trying to process what I had just escaped from. I didn't know what that place was or what the old man really wanted, but I knew one thing. I was done. Done with this neighborhood. Done with that house. Done with everything. As I got to my feet, I noticed something strange. The old man's house. It looked different. Older. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging, like it had been abandoned for years. The porch was rotting, covered in leaves and dirt, as if no one had set foot there in a long time. It didn't make sense. I'd seen him. I'd been inside. But now it looked like no one had lived there in decades. I stumbled back toward my house, my mind reeling. Everything was a blur: Jake, the old man, the house. None of it added up. But as I turned the corner, something caught my eye. There, on the sidewalk, was Jake's backpack. The same one I'd seen in the old man's yard. Only this time, it was empty, just lying there, as if nothing had ever been inside at all. And that's when I realized the truth. Jake hadn't disappeared. He was never there to begin with.